There's a big change happening at the moment in the scientific world. The materialist view of nature, which has dominated science since the end of the 19th century, is crumbling. And in many ways, the sciences are just growing out of what has become a restrictive dogmatic framework. This is the theme of my book, The Science Delusion, in which I talk about the 10 dogmas of science, which are the kind of default pre-installed worldview that most educated people have, not just scientists, but people educated in the arts as well. And I show that every one of these 10 dogmas is being superseded by science itself. I won't go through all 10 dogmas, but I'll just mention 2 or 3 of them to give you a flavour. One, the first and foremost, is that nature is mechanical, it's machine-like. It has no purpose, it's just based on mechanical forces pushing and pulling. Well, that is being challenged in all sorts of ways. It's only a metaphor to start with, it's not a really testable theory. But the Big Bang theory of the universe, the cosmology that came in 1966, really portrays a universe that starts very small, less than the size of the head of a pin, and has been growing ever since. And this is much more like a developing organism than it is like any machine we're familiar with. At the same time, the Gaia hypothesis invites us to think of our planet Earth as a living organism rather than a machine. And an entire philosophy of organism, started in the 1920s by the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, has become more and more attractive as the years have gone on. So the idea that nature is mechanical is just a metaphor, and science itself is changing its metaphors with the Big Bang and the Gaia theory and many others. The idea that all the laws of nature are fixed, which is another of these dogmas, made sense before 1966, when people thought the universe was eternal, governed by eternal laws. But in a radically evolutionary universe, the possibility that they may not be laws, which is after all a very anthropocentric metaphor, only humans have laws and only civilized humans have laws, but the regularities of nature may be more like habits, there may be a memory in nature. This is an idea being seriously discussed now within the sciences, including cosmology. The idea that the total amount of matter and energy is fixed, the principle of the conservation of matter and energy, which all of us learned at school and often think of as one of the surest facts at the basis of science, turns out to be just an assumption too. In the 17th century, when scientists thought that God had made the world machine and fixed the laws of nature and then pressed the start button, and it had gone on automatically ever since, they assumed that when God made it, the total number of atoms in the universe and the total amount of movement or energy would remain always the same. It was a theological assumption to start with. It was codified in the 19th century in the principles of conservation of matter and energy. But while most of us take these laws seriously, physicists themselves feel much freer, because they, after all, make up the laws of nature. And in the 1980s, when they found that stars in galaxies were moving around too fast to be explained by the gravitational pull of the galaxy, and when they found that galaxies were attracting each other too strongly to be explained in terms of the amount of matter within them, they had a big problem. Either their understanding of the cosmos was wrong, they didn't like to think that, most of them, some did, but most didn't, or there must be a lot more matter in galaxies than anyone had ever thought. And because it couldn't be seen and wasn't detectable by any known means, they called it dark matter. So how much dark matter is there in the universe? Well, it's easy. You just titrate in exactly the amount you need to make the equations work. And so then the whole theory works perfectly. And if there's any problem, if a galaxy has an unusual bulge or something, just put in more dark matter to explain the bulge. You can explain everything with this theory. It's a wonderful theory, except it's not testable because no one knows what dark matter is. They increase the total amount of matter by about 5-fold at a stroke of a pen. Having increased the amount of matter, it meant the universe should have a lot more gravitation. Therefore, it should be pulling everything together, so the expansion of the cosmos should be slowing down. And then it should stop expanding and then begin to contract faster and faster till it all ended in tears, in the reverse of the Big Bang, known as the Big Crunch. Well, until 1999, that was the favoured view. But then observation showed that the most distant galaxies were actually moving away faster and faster the further they were away. The universe was not slowing down in its expansion, it was speeding up. So how could they possibly explain that? Well, there must be another form of energy that's pushing it apart. And we don't know what it is, it's never been observed, so let's call it dark energy. And so now, in the standard model of cosmology, as it's called, dark matter and dark energy make up 96% of physical reality. It's as if science has discovered the cosmic unconscious. And the matter and energy you learned about at school, which you thought of as being strictly conserved, are only 4% of physical reality. We haven't a clue what the rest is or how it works. We don't know whether it can be converted into regular matter and energy or not, and we don't know whether the total amount's the same. In fact, the usual theories of dark energy say that the energy density of the universe is constant, but since the universe is expanding, that means the total amount of energy must be increasing. So actually, officially now, the universe is at least implicitly a perpetual motion machine. So this is one of the other assumptions of science, and this prohibition, the idea of dark matter and the conservation of matter and energy, underlay the great taboo against perpetual motion engines, a taboo built into science right in the beginning of the 17th century, which is why scientists tend to ridicule people who claim to have free energy or above unity energy devices. However, despite the fact they're taboo, there are now quite a few of these devices working, some of them on a prototype commercial basis. The energy seems to be coming from a new kind of nuclear reaction called low-energy nuclear reactions. They don't emit radioactive isotopes or harmful radiation. They promise vast amounts of energy without pollution and could obviously be of enormous relevance. It's only in the last few months that it's become clear how promising these technologies are. But they're still taboo and they're not discussed in universities or funded by governments because we've got a dogmatic belief system about energy and matter. Well, I won't go on about that. I just saying that the scene has changed enormously since most of us were at school. And the sciences are now in a kind of extraordinary state of flux. There are still sort of hardcore bits like molecular biology, which are fairly unreconstructed, but there are large areas where debates are going on that would not have been possible even 2 decades ago. Now, the old view, the materialist orthodoxy on which science was based on the philosophy rather than science, the philosophy of materialism. And the philosophy of materialism says matter is the only reality. That's why it's called materialism. It says, therefore, that the whole of the universe is made up of matter. That matter is unconscious. And that matter, being the only reality, is unconscious and everything's unconscious. Now, that at one stroke got rid of God and the angels, which is the main reason that materialists wanted to be materialists, because it supported an atheist worldview. And in the 19th century, a lot of people were struggling against reactionary regimes which were allied to the church. In Russia, the Orthodox Church; in France, the Catholic Church. And the best way to be a revolutionary was to undermine the legitimacy of the state so closely allied to the church. And if God didn't exist, the whole thing was a make-believe. So for political reasons, it became very important, materialism. It does, however, lead to a terrible problem, which is that if everything's unconscious and matter's the only reality, how come we're conscious? And this is a crisis in philosophy of mind throughout the 20th century, going right up to today. And among philosophers of mind, this is called the hard problem. It's the hard problem because you can't really explain how brute unconscious matter could generate minds. There's been, in the last 2 or 3 years, a rather large-scale movement within philosophy and among some neuroscientists in favor of panpsychism, saying you can't explain consciousness emerging from unconscious matter, but what if there's a kind of psyche or spirit or soul in matter all the way down to electrons and so on? And that's now quite a respectable intellectual position, panpsychism. The American philosopher of mind, Thomas Nagel, wrote a book a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. And it caused a furore in the intellectual world, and he was denounced by fellow atheists. He's an atheist himself. But he had the courage to suggest that the whole cosmic evolutionary process has some kind of purpose instead of no purpose, which is the official view, and that there's consciousness of many kinds and at many levels in nature. Well, this is interesting because when we come to spiritual practices, which is the main theme of my talk this evening, the key question really is, do we live in an unconscious universe or a conscious one? All religions, all spiritual traditions assume that underlying all reality and underlying our own consciousness, there is a conscious, underlying conscious reality. Whereas materialists assume that underlying all reality is nothing but unconscious matter, that we live in an unconscious universe made of unconscious stars and galaxies that came about by chance in accordance with impersonal laws, and that if consciousness has evolved in human brains here on Earth and maybe in the brains of a few other animals, then this is a kind of isolated phenomenon in an otherwise unconscious universe. There might be little green men on other planets who are conscious, but that's science fiction at present. As far as we know, from that point of view, we're the only conscious beings in an otherwise entirely unconscious universe. Well, there's no evidence for that, it's just an assumption. If we take the view that consciousness is fundamental, that it underlies all reality, which is the view in all traditions of all spiritual and religious traditions, including Buddhism, often portrayed as being non-theistic, but that too has the idea there's a ground of consciousness from which our own minds emerge. In Hinduism, in the Kena Upanishad, there's a marvelous verse that says, "Not that which is seen by the eye, but that whereby the eye can see. Know that alone to be Brahman, the Lord." So that our consciousness is derived from the divine consciousness and is a conscious source of our consciousness, and indeed of all other kinds of consciousness in the universe. Well, this makes a difference to the way you interpret spiritual practices. And I'll start by saying something about meditation. Many people meditate. I do myself. It's become very mainstream in Britain. I remember when I first did it in the 1970s, I did transcendental meditation at that stage. It was very exotic, and most people had never heard of it. Most people, if you mentioned the word meditation, they thought you meant thinking, and you had to explain how you mean not thinking. So there was a terrible confusion of language. But now most people are familiar with meditation. In fact, you can now get it on the NHS. You can get a prescription for meditation, because the National Institute of Clinical Excellence has done randomized trials in which people with mild or moderate depression are sent at random either to a meditation course where they learn meditation or to a psychiatrist who gives them antidepressant drugs. And they found that the people who go on the meditation course have a better chance of recovering from meditation, and more importantly for the NHS, it's cheaper. So now many NHS trusts are employing trained meditation teachers, and people are rolling out more meditation teaching courses because of the demand. And a lot of people are now meditating in this purely secularized form. more than 100 MPs have taken up mindfulness meditation. It's taught in some corporations, and it's taught in quite a lot of schools. So the reason it's being taught in this secular, rather atheistic society is because it's been proved to work. It makes people happier, more balanced, less depressed. There's a lot of scientific evidence for that. It reduces stress, it reduces blood pressure, it leads to improved physical health and mental health. So there's a lot going for it. But of course, in traditional cultures where people have meditated, in Buddhism, for example, or in Hinduism, or in Christianity, especially in the Greek Orthodox tradition, the prayer of the heart is a form of Christian meditation. Where people have traditionally meditated, they haven't done so just to get lower blood pressure or to ward off depression. And they haven't done it because it's been scientifically proved. They know that it works and it's part of the culture. And when they do it, they think that their mind is, when the chatter of thoughts stills, that the mind becomes part of a greater mind, that a kind of mystical experience which involves a contact of our own conscious mind with a greater mind, which is the ground of our own consciousness. This is what people experience directly through meditation. Not always in the beginning stages, but this is something that often happens. And in traditional cultures, this has been seen as one way of actually linking our own minds to the mind of God or to the ultimate consciousness of the universe. For atheists who meditate, and some atheists do meditate, it's something quite different. For example, Susan Blackmore, who's a fairly militant atheist, and Sam Harris, who's one of the new atheist movement in the US, author of The End of Faith. He meditates too. Some of the other atheists attack him because they think he ought not to, because it's giving the wrong message. But he does it because he says it helps him feel better and cope with life better. But Susan Blackmore and Sam Harris don't believe in God or that there's any greater consciousness. They're materialists. They think it's working just by sort of changing the activity in their brain, affecting neurotransmitters, and so affecting heartbeat through neuro and hormonal mechanisms. Well, that's fine. You don't have to believe that there's something beyond your brain when you meditate, but for most people who meditate, it seems fairly obvious that there is. But they're still able to do it within the framework of a materialist belief system. Not all forms of spiritual practices are so easily fitted into a materialist belief system, but there is another one that's now very solidly backed by scientific evidence, and which again doesn't require a religious worldview or a spiritual worldview, and that's gratitude. One of the things that has changed in psychology in the last 20 years has been the growth of the positive psychology movement. I don't know how many of you are aware of that, but it's become a major influence, and it's now taught in universities as part of psychology courses. The founders of it, I suppose it really starts with Abraham Maslow at the Esalen Institute in the 60s, who started talking about peak experiences, which is another word for mystical type experiences that change people's lives. And since then, there's been a movement within psychology of people who've been trying to study not what makes people unhappy, which most psychology has been about that since Freud and so on. Most psychologists have been dealing with neurotic or psychotic or depressed or schizophrenic people who are miserable. And so the main focus of psychology has been human misery. Whereas positive psychology says, well, let's change this. Of course, it's important to deal with human misery, but let's look at what makes people happy. And one of the first scientific studies was by an American researcher called Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, almost impossible to spell. But what he did was got volunteers, attached to them little bleepers, and they asked them at random times during the day when they heard the bleeper go to write down what they were doing and to rate their happiness on 1 to 9 scale. And then they got all the results together, and then they looked at what people were doing when they were feeling happy. And of course people weren't happy all the time, and sometimes more happy than others. What was it that made them feel happy? And people felt happy when they were in a state of flow, when they were absorbed in some work they really liked, when they were playing music, when they were singing, when they were dancing, when they were engaged in sports where they're completely absorbed in the sports activities, when they were in an animated conversation with a friend, when they were making love, when they were in a state of flow, when not as opposed to standing back wondering, why am I doing this, what's wrong with me, why doesn't that happen, why didn't she be nicer to me, and why didn't so-and-so say thank you, and I wonder if I'll be able to get the bus in time, and so forth. All the normal chattering thoughts that, but when people were in the state of flow, they weren't thinking about those kinds of things. And dancing is a great way. Sports too. I mean, if you're doing downhill skiing and going down very fast down a slope, you have to be utterly present in what you're doing. You can't be sort of worrying about all these trivial things, distracted from what you're doing. You have to be present. So that was one of the first discoveries of positive psychology, that you have to be in a state of flow. And then they looked at other things that made people happy. And one of them was feeling grateful. I mean, in a sense, they were proving the obvious. We all know that people who see the glass as half full are generally speaking happier than people who see it as half empty. Some people feel grateful for what happens in their life a lot of the time, whereas others just moan and complain. And they found that gratitude, which is encouraged by all religious traditions, all of them have thanksgiving and prayers and so on, that gratitude is one of the most fundamental, simple, everyday practices that can really change people's lives. So now this is taught in schools, it's studied in psychology departments. There are now hundreds of self-help books full of gratefulness exercises. And some of them are basically what my grandmother and my mother both used to say to you, and you may have had people who said it to you as children, you count your blessings. Just think of all the things that are good about your life and the things that are going well. And if you count your blessings, there are a whole series of exercises where you can make lists every day and make lists about all the people you're grateful to and all the things you're grateful for, good health and food and so on. And when you think how lucky we are to live here in England in a peaceful country, and how lucky we are not to live in Raqqa in Syria or in some of these other terribly blighted and destroyed places. So counting your blessings is one of the exercises. They also did experiments. The key figure in this is a chap called Martin Seligman, who's written books on positive psychology. They found one of the most effective practices was to ask people to think of somebody who'd helped them in their life who they'd never properly thanked, and then to write a thank you letter to that person saying, thank you so much, I've never properly thanked you, but I'm really grateful, you really helped me, etc. And then to go to that person and read them the thank you letter. They found that people who did that were measurably happier up to a month later than people who'd been given the control exercise, which was to write a short story about their childhood or some other writing task, rather than the gratitude one. So what they were trying to do there was, using scientific methodology, answer the question that is it just a correlation? Are people grateful because they're happy, or are people happy because they're grateful? Because the critics said, oh, well, these are just people. The people who feel grateful because they're happy people. They've got a lot to be grateful for. But people who are sick and miserable and stuff, they're not feeling so grateful because they don't have so much to be grateful for. No, what they showed was that it's more than just a correlation, because by these kind of studies, the gratitude letter exercise, for example, that people who did gratefulness exercises actually became happier as a result. And these are terribly simple things to do, and everybody in traditional societies does them. If you go to church, then quite a lot of the psalms and the hymns are about giving thanks to God. If you Hindu prayers, Muslim prayers, many forms of prayer and spiritual practice involve giving thanks. There are whole national institutions of this, like the American Thanksgiving dinner, which is their foremost national ritual. And a very simple way, a very traditional way of putting this into practice is to give thanks before meals. It's what people have done all through history, except in a modern secular society, people are sort of vaguely embarrassed about it, even if they think it's a good idea, and they assume others will object because they're atheists. And so it doesn't happen. I mean, most places I go to have dinner, people don't say grace. They look a bit shifty and uncomfortable, and then somebody says, well, oh, don't wait, do start, or bon appetit, or something like that. But we at home have developed a variety of methods. I'm not saying ours is a special home, it's a normal home, and lots of people do this. There's nothing special about it. 100 years ago, virtually everyone would have done it. And in fact, I read an article about Downton Abbey, the TV series, which said that viewers may have noticed that you never see them actually starting a meal. And that's because they would have said grace before meals. But they've cut that bit out because they don't want to offend the sensibilities of atheists. They're afraid of upsetting atheists in the population. So you always see them well into the meal. You can't see the beginning, because if they started without grace, it wouldn't be true to the period. And if they have the grace, then some people, maybe Richard Dawkins, might get upset. So it's okay to offend Christians and religious people. It's not okay to offend atheists. So a very simple practice, the simplest of all, which we do before every meal at home, is just to hold hands round the table for a short period of silence, and then everyone can come to a kind of reflection and break the flow of chatter and just centre before eating. Sometimes one of us says grace. Sometimes when we've got a larger number of people, we sing grace. And there are quite a few sung graces that already exist, but I challenged my sons, who are both musicians, last year. I said, I don't want stuff for Christmas. I got too much stuff, and most of us have got too much stuff. What I'd like is new graces that we can all sing together. So I commissioned graces for Christmas, and they came up with a couple of very nice graces, and we sing them now at Christmas and on family gatherings. And there's a new website just been put up by a family in Canada called graces.io. I don't know what IO means, but it's a website where they're putting up a whole series of graces, and they'll soon be having sung graces that you can sing along with and learn. So I think this is an incredibly simple spiritual practice, and it's very traditional, and yet always fresh. Last night I had dinner on high table in my college at Cambridge, Clare College, and dinner then, as always, is preceded by long Latin grace and followed by Latin grace. The butler rings a gong, everyone stands up, the students and the fellows. The dean read out this long Latin grace. And some people say amen, others don't, and you sit down. It's just a matter of course in a traditional society to give thanks before meals. And that's something we can very easily restore if we want to in our own lives. And it even has the seal of approval of positive psychology. Now, another form of spiritual practice that I'm very interested in myself is pilgrimage. In traditional societies, they all have pilgrimages. I lived in India for 7 years, and when I lived in India, I couldn't fail to notice that Hindus there were going on pilgrimages. When I worked in an international scientific institute, and I was head of a department, and so my staff had to ask me for leave. I had to sign their leave papers, and at least once a week one of the staff would come and say, could I sign a leave paper so they could take leave, because they were going on a pilgrimage with their family. And off they went, and they often came back with their head shaved, because in some pilgrimages you shave your head in the temple. They usually came back with blessed food from the temple, prasad, which they shared with me and others at work. And I thought this was what a wonderful thing, they're doing this. And then in the countryside, there are you see these groups of pilgrims wandering or walking along in groups, walking to shrines or temples or holy mountains or sacred caves or the source of the Ganges. Sadhus, these orange-clad holy men, thousands of them go around India on pilgrimages all the time. And if you go to Indian pilgrimage temples, there's this constant stream of people arriving at the temple and giving thanks and making offerings and praying. They go on a pilgrimage. It's not just a walk. It's a journey with an intention, going to a sacred place. And they had a variety of intentions. I asked people sometimes, and sometimes when they were saying them out loud to some figure, I got Indian friends to translate for me. Most of them were fairly mundane, we want to marry our daughter off, but we haven't got a big enough dowry. Oh God, please help us to find a suitable husband for our daughter who won't need a big dowry. Or, my mother's sick, please make her better. Or, we're opening a new business, may it prosper and be profitable. Some were for spiritual guidance, but most were fairly mundane, straightforward, worldly things. But there's no real division there between the worldly and the spiritual. They interpenetrate. And when Indians move into a new house or build a new house, they usually get the local holy man to come and bless it, because they wouldn't want to live in a house that hasn't been blessed. Most people here might have a housewarming party, but entirely secular. You can have it blessed if you want. Whenever I've moved into a new house in the last 20 years or lived in a new place, I've asked the local vicar to come and bless it, and all of them have just said, yes, we'd be happy to, and they come with holy water and candles and do a great job. Some of them are very thorough, starting off blessing the whole street outside, and then the front door, and then going from room to room, and opening all the cupboards and making sure that the whole place is thoroughly spiritually purified. In Japan, at Shinto shrines, they have spiritual car washes where people drive in, and Shinto priests with little sort of feather things sprinkle holy water over the car. But why not? If we're going to have these things, is it better for them to be blessed or unblessed? So pilgrimages are journeys with an intention. And of course Muslims have them on a big scale. I mean, Mecca, millions of pilgrims a year go to Mecca. And in Europe, there were many, many places of pilgrimage. In England, in the Middle Ages, the most important in England was Canterbury, of course, the shrine of St. Thomas a Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. And that's what the storyline of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is all about. Chaucer's talking about, he's writing the stories of the people on this pilgrimage. Most of the stories are not very pious at all. In fact, a great deal of them are about sexual adventures of a very disreputable kind. But that's what pilgrims probably did talk about. It was fun. They didn't have holidays in our modern sense of secular holidays. And still most people in India don't have just holidays. You have a pilgrimage, which is a holy day. The days you go on a pilgrimage is a holy day. And of course you have fun, and of course you meet new people and have adventures and so on. Well, the second most important place of pilgrimage in England was the Shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham in Norfolk, the Black Madonna of Walsingham, where there was a holy well and this Black Madonna, who was a focus of great deal of popular devotion. But at the Reformation, pilgrimages were banned all over Protestant Europe. In the 1530s, Thomas Cromwell issued an injunction against pilgrimage, and people were forbidden to go on pilgrimage. They were told it was idolatrous, and it was idolatrous because it involved going to see these shrines, and these shrines had no scriptural authority, because nothing in the Bible talks about Walsingham or Canterbury. It only talks about Jerusalem and places in the Holy Land. So pilgrimage was stamped out forcefully with the use of the army. The shrines were desecrated. The image of the Black Madonna of Walsingham was burned in a public bonfire. The same happened in Germany and in Scandinavia at the Reformation. But this left a basic human urge unsatisfied in the Protestant countries. I think it's a basic human urge to go to a place on a kind of journey. Our ancestors, hunter-gatherers, moved around. Hunter-gatherers have to move to hunt and gather. They can't just stay in one place. It's the Neolithic revolution with agriculture that led to settled villages and cities. But hunter-gatherers moved, and as they moved, they told the story of the land they were going through, and there were sacred places on the way. The Australian Aborigines songlines are one example of this that persisted right into the 20th century. So I think pilgrimage is deep in our nature, and many species of animals are migratory. They have two homes, like English swallows breed here, they have a home here, and then in the autumn they go to southern Africa, flying all the way across the Sahara to a home there, and then they come back here to breed, often to the very same building where they make their nest. So I think there's something deeply biological and archetypal about pilgrimage. So what happened when the English suppressed pilgrimage under Thomas Cromwell at the time of the Reformation was that the need was unsatisfied, and within a few generations the English had invented a secular substitute called tourism. In the 18th century, the wealthy sons of aristocrats went on the grand tour, and they went to Rome and to St. Peter's and to Greece and to Athens and the Parthenon, the great temples, and the more adventurous people, as it got safer to travel, went to Egypt to see the pyramids and the temples. These tourists, and still today, which is now, it's a multi-trillion-dollar global industry, tourism, but tourists still go to see principally the sacred places. In France, everyone who goes to Paris goes to see Notre Dame Cathedral. If they come to London, they go to Westminster Abbey. If they go to Egypt, they go to see the great temples. If they go to Athens, they go to the Acropolis to see the Parthenon, the great temple of the goddess Athena. In the ancient world, these temples were centres of at least local pilgrimage. Stonehenge, built about 2500 BC, wouldn't have made sense unless it had been a focus where people had gone for the festivals on a pilgrimage. In classical Greece, there was a festival called the Athenia, when all the people who had an affinity to Athens, including Athenians who were living abroad in the diaspora, came back to Athens for this great festival. They had processions around the Acropolis, the hill in Athens, to the Parthenon, the temple of Athena, the goddess of Athens. The processions are represented in the friezes of the Parthenon, and they're not in Greece, of course, they're in the British Museum, so you can actually see these pilgrim processions here in London. And the Jews went on pilgrimages to Jerusalem for special festivals. A lot of the New Testament revolves around these festivals when people went to Jerusalem, like the Passover. So these are very basic patterns. Modern tourists still go to these sacred places, but the trouble is they have to pretend to be modern, enlightened, scientific, rational people who are interested in art history. They've risen above the superstitions of religion, where they can get down on their knees and say a prayer or light a candle. They're somehow above that. That's for ignorant, superstitious people. They're going there because they're interested in history and art. So guides spring up to fill them with information. This building was built in 352 BC and contains 50 million tons of stone, etc., etc. Facts that go in one ear and out the other, because that's not really why they're there. They're there because they're drawn to these places, but they're disempowered because they're modern, rational, not really rational, of course, but supposedly rational, modern, enlightened, educated people. They can't actually do what a pilgrim would do and make the most of it, so it's terribly wasted. And they can't make a sacrifice there, like offering some food and bringing some back to share with people at home. Instead, they take photographs. And they do try and share those with people back home, but they're usually not that well received. It's much more fun to receive some food that's been blessed in the temple and feel you're part of this ceremony, as I discovered in India, than to have to sit through an hour and a half of people's holiday photographs. They do bring back souvenirs, but again, in a proper pilgrimage, you bring back holy water or something of particular sacred significance. Interestingly, a paradigm change is actually happening in the modern world completely below the radar, which is the paradigm shift back from tourism into pilgrimage. There's been an extraordinary growth of pilgrimage in the last 30 years. Everybody nowadays has heard of the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. The Camino. There are actually 7 or 8 different routes to Santiago, starting in France and Spain and Portugal. This was indeed one of the great places of pilgrimage in the Middle Ages, Santiago de Compostela. But at the time of the Reformation, a lot of those pilgrims came from England and Germany. So at the time of the Reformation, all the pilgrims from Northern Europe just stopped. And so the pilgrimage declined. And then in the French Revolution, all the pilgrims from France stopped because the French revolutionaries were anti-Christian. They declared reason as the state religion, and during the Reign of Terror executed thousands of priests and converted the Cathedral of Notre Dame and other churches into temples of reason, and actually forbade pilgrimage. And when people were being guillotined all over the place, and they said, you can't go on pilgrimage, most people said, okay. In the 19th century, the number of pilgrims to Santiago was a mere trickle, and through most of the 20th century. But a group of people, led by a Spanish poet, revived this pilgrimage in the 1980s. At first he went with a group of friends, 20 or 30 friends. In 1989, they put out more publicity. 1,000 people went to Santiago. Last year, there were 285,000 pilgrims going to Santiago. But what most people don't realize is this is very recent. It's the last 25 years, this boom in pilgrimage. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe, the old pilgrim paths are being opened up. In Wales and Scotland, there are groups opening up these paths. In Norway, 10 years ago, the old pilgrim route from Oslo to Trondheim to the shrine of St. Olaf was reopened. And it's now a very popular new pilgrimage. It was closed down by the Reformation. It's come back again just in the last 10 years. And there's a new initiative here in Britain called the British Pilgrimage Trust, led by some young people, mostly based in London, who are reopening the old pilgrimage routes on footpaths across Britain. They've recharted the route from Winchester to Canterbury, the South Downs Way, which they're trying to make into, as it were, the Camino of England, the iconic pilgrimage route of England. So most people, if they want to go on a pilgrimage, think they've got to go to Spain and do the Camino, which is a good thing to do. But what they're trying to show is, starting this year, is have the information available so you can do it in England. And we can do it in our own country, those of us who are English. And those of us who are not English can get to know England a lot better by going on pilgrimages to our holy places. I was very inspired by these young men, and I had last year had an idea about what to do about the birthday of my godson, who was 14, and he's a rather sophisticated young man who's got everything, rich family, and I work on this principle I already mentioned, not giving people stuff, because we've all got too much, certainly he has, but experiences. So I thought about it, and then I said to him, your birthday present this year, if you want it, is a pilgrimage to Canterbury. We take the train to Chartham, which is about 8 miles from Canterbury. We follow the last part of the Pilgrim's Way through the fields, the meadows, the orchards, the hills. Lunch at Bigbury Hill, which is an Iron Age hill fort, picnic lunch. Then I said we'll go to the Black Prince's Well in Harbledon, which is near Canterbury. And then we'll go to Canterbury itself and we'll light candles at the shrine, go with an intention, pray for people and for ourselves, and go to Choral Evensong and have a cream tea and come home on the high-speed train. And I wasn't sure if he'd go for this or not. He said yes. And we had a blissful day, a truly blissful day. I got to know him much better, he got to know me much better. Being together on the path together is a very unifying thing to do. When we got to the Black Prince's well, it was hidden, it was overgrown. It's a healing well for people with eye problems. I've got an eye problem, so I thought, this is good, this is for me. We couldn't find it, so we had to find some almshouses. An old woman there, and we said, where is it? She said, oh, I'll show you. And she hobbled down, she says, behind that bush. And it was overgrown, we had to part the vegetation, and there was this old stone arch and moss-covered steps going down to a clear spring at the bottom. It was completely magical, about 2 miles from Canterbury, in Britain in 2015. This year we went to Ely. We took the train to Waterbeach, north of Cambridge, and we walked the last 8 miles along the River Cam, along the towpath. And there's this great cathedral rising in that flat fenland landscape. Again, we went to Choral Evensong. We had a cream tea first. He was flagging. He's not used to walking very far. We had a cream tea first to revive him. We lit candles at the shrine of St. Etheldreda, who was the great female saint around whom the Cathedral of Ely was built, a Saxon princess, AD about 700. And then we came back on the train after Evensong. Next year we'll probably go to Lincoln Cathedral. But these one-day pilgrimages are a wonderful way to spend time, and it's just in the last 2-3 years I've been doing them here in England. It's very different from just going a walk in the country, because the walk in the country doesn't really have the same kind of intention, purpose or focus. And so I think that this is a spiritual practice that I think anyone can do, and it doesn't have to be a long walk, 8 miles. It could be just a micro-pilgrimage to your local church or cathedral. Here in London we have many sacred places, and the obvious ones like St. Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey, and right near here Southwark Cathedral. And just walking there, even if it's only the last half mile or mile, and timing it to coincide with Choral Evensong is a very good way to do it, because there are these beautiful services every evening in our cathedrals all over England, and in Oxford and Cambridge colleges. Extremely good choirs, 45-minute service in Elizabethan English with exquisite music, different every day. And there's now a website where you can look them up called choralevensong.org, tell you where they are and when they are all over the country, and what music they're doing. So that's something that anyone can do, and it's an extraordinarily effective practice. And again, it has the imprimatur of science. Lots of research has shown that people engaged in purposeful activity are happier and do better than people who have relatively purposeless activity. That's the very basis of occupational therapy. There's now zillions of reports that show people who walk in the fresh air are healthier than people who sit at home and don't walk, and even healthier than people who exercise in gyms. There's something about being outdoors in the fresh air on a journey and walking outdoors, which is good for you. So for these and other reasons, pilgrimage is good for you. It's interesting. You learn something about the country, about the culture, about the history, but in a much more interesting way than arriving there in a bus or a car and just having people tell you facts, historical facts. They're still interesting, the historical facts, but it's much more important to relate to the place and relate to the history of those who've related to it. I just want to say something about rituals, because these are common to all spiritual traditions. And rituals, many of them replay the story of origins. So the rituals reenact the story of origins of a particular social group, and by taking part in them, people's identity as a member of that social group is affirmed. They're incorporated into that social group and given an identity. For example, Jewish people have been reenacting the Passover for thousands of years. And this commemorates the story when the last of the 10 curses on Egypt was brought about, which enabled Moses to take the people out of bondage in Egypt through the wilderness towards the Promised Land. It was this moment of liberation from slavery. And this curse, which involved killing the firstborn of Egyptians and of their cattle, passed over the Jews if they smeared the lintels of their houses with the blood of a lamb. That's the story. And this key story in Jewish identity is reenacted every year by Jews in the Passover festival. They eat the meal, the Passover meal, with the right kind of recipe of food, bitter herbs and so on. They tell the story. And by doing it, they connect with those who've done it right back to the first time it was done, and who are doing it all over the world. In the Christian Holy Communion, which itself is a Passover meal, Christians reenact the Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples and take the bread and the wine and take part in this ritual meal, which connects them to the whole Christian tradition, to the foundation of it through Jesus and his disciples. And it affirms their identity as Christians. Americans have a national secular ritual. I already mentioned the Thanksgiving dinner in November, where they meet together in families. For many Americans, it's more important than Christmas. It's when they all come together and have this family meal. And it's giving thanks, and it reenacts the Thanksgiving dinner of the first settlers in the New World, in New England. And of course it has an American bird, the turkey, as part of it. And by doing that, people become American as part of their identity through this ritual. It's to do with social identity. In the rituals of India, people reenact the ancient rituals using Sanskrit, which is the ancient ritual language. And in fact, most rituals are highly conservative when it comes to language. The Coptic Church in Egypt uses ancient Egyptian in its liturgy, the only place where that still survives. In the Russian Orthodox Church, they use Old Slavic, the old form of the Slavic language. In the Roman Church, till recently, they used Latin. And even in the English Church, where the language was changed to English from Latin at the time of the Reformation, many people prefer the Elizabethan language of the Book of Common Prayer, which Choral Evensong is still done in every day in cathedrals throughout the land, to the more modern form of English in the new version of the prayer book. So why is it that these rituals are so conservative, and why do all cultures have them? Even secular rituals follow the same format. It has to be done the same way, with the right kind of words, the right language, the right kind of food, the right gestures, movements, etc. Well, according to the idea of morphic resonance, my own theory of memory and nature, if something similar, a pattern of activities happens that's similar to what's happened before, there'll be a resonance across time that will connect them, and it's the basis of collective memory. So I haven't time to go into this theory in any more detail than that. It's just the briefest summary. If you're interested, it's explained in detail in my books, The Presence of the Past and A New Science of Life, and summarized in my book, The Science Delusion. But what this means is that by doing things in a similar way as possible, people will connect through the ritual by morphic resonance with all those who've done it before, right back to the first time. There'll be a literal presence of the past through taking part in this ritual. So I think this makes a great deal of sense of these rituals, whereas from a materialist and rationalist point of view, this is all just meaningless mumbo-jumbo. People are just superstitious and stupid, and they've been conditioned into doing this, but we're liberated, we realize it's all rubbish, so we don't do it. But what a loss. If you look at what happens when people stop doing these rituals, it creates a kind of desolation and lack of identity. And militant atheists are usually people who are fighting against religion because it's somehow annoyed them or pissed them off, or they've been abused, or it's somehow they feel it's oppressive. They're against things, but There's a very interesting book some of you may have read by Alain de Botton, the philosopher, called Religion for Atheists. Came out 2 or 3 years ago. And Alain de Botton starts off by saying, I'm a second-generation atheist. I was raised atheist. I take it for granted there's no God. My parents were very militant. He said if anyone visited our family, they were Jewish bankers in Zurich, his parents. He said if anyone visited our family and showed the slightest interest in any religion, my parents refused to talk to them again and would never take them seriously thereafter. He was brought up and he said, I just accept that, but I don't feel any need to be against things anymore. I'm interested in atheism 2.0. What if God doesn't exist? What do you do then? And it's a fascinating book because he says, well, look at what happens with people who are religious. They have ways they get together and they sing together and give thanks together. Atheists can't because there's nothing to make them do that. They don't sing and don't. So let's have atheist gatherings. He's one of the people behind the Sunday Assembly, which is this atheist church being set up all over Britain at the moment. Where they get together and they give thanks, and they're trying to recreate Sunday services. Then he says, then atheists don't have any models of virtue. That in the Middle Ages, chapels used to have pictures of the 7 deadly sins on one side, all the things that are bad to do, like lust, pride, envy, gluttony, anger, and so on. The 7 deadly sins are things you avoid, and on the other hand, they had the 7 virtues: temperance, fortitude, prudence, justice, faith, hope, and charity. He said, we live in a secular world where neither the virtues nor the vices are supposed to be promoted by the educational authorities or by the state. He said, but in fact, he said, the reality is there's every encouragement to the 7 deadly sins through advertising. You're encouraged to be gluttonous, lustful, envious, proud, etc. Advertising gives every incentive, saturation level of incentive to the 7 deadly sins, but there's no public incentive to virtue. So he's now trying to create a kind of humanist gallery of fame of virtue to try and promote virtue, which is completely ignored. He's also trying to promote sermons, and he says that in a secular world, a lecture is just conveying information. It's neutral, secular, conveying information. That's what the educational system's based on. But sermons, both in mosques and cathedrals and homilies and talks by gurus in India and so on, are designed to help you lead a better life. I mean, some of them work better than others, but the intention is to help you be a better person. So it's about what you might do that could make your life better. Now, a lecture doesn't do that, because lectures, in their purely secular form, are neutral. So he started Sunday sermons at Conway Hall. The trouble is that, when you go to church, which I do, I'm an Anglican, the sermon, usually quite good in our parish church in Hampstead, is embedded in a service where you're singing, you're standing up, you're praying, you're doing all other things. But the Sunday sermon at Conway Hall just has the sermon. So I feel they miss out a bit on the bits that are actually, more participatory. So the power of ritual, I think, is very strong, and one way in which is the easiest and most painless way in which anyone can experience really uplifting rituals in Britain is to do what I mentioned earlier, go to Choral Evensong, because it's a tradition, it's deeply English, it's a tradition invented in the 16th century based on the Latin and Roman prayers of Compline and Vespers, the evening prayers. Weekdays there's no sermon, it's just music and extremely beautiful prayers. Many people are atheists, enjoy going to Choral Evensong. I did myself. I was an atheist when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge. But I used to enjoy going to Evensong because it's so extremely beautiful. The chaplain, the vicar of our church in Hampstead was formerly chaplain of New College, Oxford, Richard Dawkins College. And I said to him, did Richard Dawkins come to chapel much? He said, oh yes, he loves Choral Evensong. Yes, it's his favourite service. And Dawkins describes himself as a cultural Anglican. So nobody's going to wait at the door and question you about your beliefs, and you're not going to have to confess to anything or anything. Well, there is a confession which in the service, but it's a very generic one, and probably most of us feel there are some things we've done that we don't think were totally okay. But it's the most wonderful thing, and again, it's utterly available and completely free. You have to pay £18 to go into Westminster Abbey during the daytime. If you go to Choral Evensong at 5 p.m, practically every day, it's free. It's always free. And Oxford and Cambridge colleges, there's 20 colleges doing it. Everyone's heard of King's College Chapter in Cambridge, but there are 20 other colleges doing it as well. And I went 2 days ago to Queen's College, Cambridge, which is just brilliantly beautiful service. So there's a form of ritual, and which I don't know, there haven't yet been any scientific studies on the effects of choral evensong, but it wouldn't be too difficult to do them. There have been studies on choir, singing in choirs, and people who sing in choirs, of course, have to breathe together, because if you're singing together, you have to take a breath at the same time between the verses in a hymn, for example. So you're breathing together, but people come into a physiological synchrony. Their heartbeats tend to synchronize. There have been now physiological studies of choirs that are singing. I think one reason there's this big revival of choral singing in Britain, there are all these choirs, and Gareth Malone, and choirs on TV, and all sorts of community choirs, is precisely because it makes you happier. You're doing something with other people. You feel part of something bigger than yourself. And it does bring you into a kind of physiological link with others. And the problem of our society is this excessive individualism, which, when carried to its extreme, results in chronic loneliness. And the disease of the modern world is extreme loneliness, especially for old people, and endemic depression throughout the whole society. And I think all these happen because these spiritual channels have been blocked off. And if we reopen them, I think that it's possible to have a much more satisfying, connected and useful life. Very surprisingly, last week, I got an email which went through my website to my assistant from someone saying, I've seen some of your videos on YouTube, I want to come and talk to you. I get quite a lot of emails like that, and she replies and says, if you're interested in Rupert's work, look at the FAQs on his website and take a look at his book, The Science Delusion, and then if you've done a bit of homework, get back to us, sort of thing. Because it's surprising how many people think that on the basis of a 15-minute video they should online. So anyway, she sent it on to me, as she does with all the. I read all the emails I get, and it was signed. Russell, and the line said Russell True, and then then she sent the thing, and the reply came back saying, "Okay, I can see Rupert's really busy, but if he does want to reach out, please pass on my email, Russell Brand." So Russell Brand came to see me a few days ago, and it was a fascinating discussion, because Russell Brand was an extreme addict. He was a heroin addict, a crack addict, and a sex addict. His life it really bottomed out. He had an extraordinarily extreme experience of indulging in everything, the kind of ultimate materialist, hedonist lifestyle, which turned toxic. And he underwent a 12-step recovery program in some Christian retreat centre in London. And he came out of it unaddicted and with a sense of the connection with the world of the spirit, because the 12-step program, as I've not done it myself, but some of you might have done, but the first step in the 12-step program, which is the basis of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and a lot of these recovery groups, the first step is to acknowledge that you're helpless by yourself, and you have to acknowledge a power greater than yourself. And the last step is to say, I acknowledge this power greater than myself. I want to turn over my life to working in service to this greater power. Russell Brand is a kind of convert to that point of view, and he's now has this kind of spiritual mission where he feels that Britain's got, our culture's, most people through secularism materialism in its vulgar sense, shopping malls, consumerism, etc., have had the spiritual channels we all need blocked off, and that there's a desperate need to find ways of reopening them for the health and sanity of our society. So he's now setting off on a new career as a kind of spiritual missionary. How far it goes and how successful he is, I don't know, but he's certainly very passionate about it. And it's a very interesting sign of the times. His, we'll hear more about this, I'm quite sure, because he's very articulate. But I do think we're in a state, you see, where the old certainty of the belief in science, reason, and progress, which was the Enlightenment agenda, it was liberating, it was helpful. In the 19th century, it reached its apogee, and then through 20th century technologies, and in the 21st century, computers, the internet. All this is immensely impressive. But it doesn't have to be allied to a materialist worldview. It's quite possible to have a quite different kind of science, which is much more open, much less dogmatically committed to an ideology. That, as I say, is the point of my book, The Science Delusion, which in America is called Science Set Free, which is actually a better title for it. So I think that we're in this extraordinarily interesting state of transition at the moment, because the old dogmatic materialism is fraying at the edges, crumbling in the middle. It's no longer, it's still defended by rather strident defenders like Richard Dawkins. But nowadays, especially among younger scientists, it's rather rare to meet Dawkinsites. Most of them are much more interested in explorations. A lot of young scientists meditate. Many of them take psychedelics and go on ayahuasca ceremonies, which is a kind of a ceremonial form of taking a psychedelic on a kind of spiritual journey. Some go on pilgrimages. So many have various religious practices. So they're not all dogmatic materialists at all, but the press and the media and most people still think that's how it is. One of the things I'm trying to do at the moment is promote a coming out movement within the sciences, because so many scientists don't believe this stuff, and yet they keep quiet when they're at work. And the same is true in the medical profession. And if they actually talk freely to their colleagues, I think it would have a very liberating effect on science and medicine. Well, that's enough to give a flavour of some of the ways in which looking at spiritual practices through a lens of science can help us to see that actually every single one of them that I've discussed today is good for us. It's good, it's helpful, it's healthy, it's wholesome. And of course, all spiritual practices, anything can be abused, so you can find abuses of all these things. But on the whole, the alternative to this is not to have any spiritual practices and to believe in the materialist worldview that tells you your mind's nothing but your brain, we live in a pointless universe, evolution's only a matter of blind chance, and when you die, that's the end of it. Well, most people are brought up to believe those things. Personally, I don't think any of them are true, and I don't think that any of them are supported by science. I think they're all, at the very best, or at least, open questions. And I think that as we actually try and experience these things and go on these journeys of exploration, all our lives can be transformed. And I agree with Russell Brand in thinking that this is going to become quite a widespread social movement. It'll be very surprising for people who are used to growing up in a dogmatically rationalistic and secular society. But I think we're already seeing these astonishing grassroots movements all over the place. So I think it's a time of transition, and that's really my message. Thank you.